first thing we're going to do is we are going to create a French seam on the side seam of our bodice. So we are going, I marked my front on the front bodice, and then this is the back. So we're going to put wrong sides together for a French seam, together on both sides. We're going to stitch a regular stitch along here. Once you've done a seam on both sides with a tiny seam allowance, you want to press it, and then we're going to flip it so it's right sides together, and we're going to sew this so that the seam allowance gets caught on the inside and you don't see it. I always like to press a French seam before I go to sew it, and we'll do the same on the other side. So once you've sewn along the seam allowance again there, so you open it up, so this is right, so these are my right sides of the fabric, and you might have like a little piece like this to trim off, but now you have like a really nice finish. So I'm just going to give that a quick press. Now we're going to take our sleeve pattern and we're going to French seam that along the side seam here as well. So we are going to put it wrong sides together. So remember, French seam is always wrong side together. Most other things is right sides together. So we'll do that for both of our sleeves. And again, sew with a small seam allowance, press, and flip to the other side and stitch. We're going to do the same thing for the ruffle. So this is the ruffle that goes on the bottom of the sleeve. And we're going to pin that wrong sides together and make a French seam in the same way that we did with the bodice and the sleeve. Okay, so I've stitched it with a small seam allowance, and I'm going to flip it. So this is right sides together now, and then I will just stitch that, press it and stitch it again. So we're making a French seam with the ruffle on the sleeve. So we're doing a French seam as we did before with the ruffle wrong sides to wrong sides. And I stitch that down. I'm going to press and continue the same method to make a French seam. And then once we're done the French seam, I'm going to come back and go a bit more in depth on how to put the elastic in the sleeve. So now that you have your sleeve with the French seamed ruffle complete, we're going to look at it inside out. We're going to take our elastic, and the length of the elastic should be in your pattern. And first of all, we are going to pin it on here at the side seam and move it around to the other side and pin it down. And I'm pinning it just above the stitching for the French seam. So this elastic is a fair bit shorter than the width of your sleeve, so it's going to gather it in. This does mean it's a little bit tricky to sew, but take your time. I'll show you how in just one sec. Okay, so I pinned it down there, and I'm just going to stitch this real quick. So I've quickly gone and stitched that in place right here. So now we are going to, okay, so you can see how like this is much smaller. I like to stretch the fabric out flat, so I'm just, my hand's inside, I'm just opening it up. And I'm going to take at about the halfway mark, I'm going to pin down without stabbing myself the elastic part right there. Okay, so you can, if you want to, stretch it out and like pin it in a couple spots around. And so it pins like that. Some people like to stretch out the elastic while they sew it. And if you want to, you can hand base this in place before you sew it if you're having a hard time actually stitching it down and you want the elastic to be pretty much like the bottom of the elastic touching this, like, or right above this stitching line right here. So I'm going to sew it on this side so it'll be lined up. It's hard to see under the sewing machine, but it's going to be, you want to sew it like right where my thumbnail is, like along that edge. with this stretched out so that this fabric is flat, and then we'll scrunch in when you're done. So now I've got this under my machine here, and you want to be really careful that this isn't bunched up. And so I'm going to sew along this edge here. This is my French seam stitch. This is where I'm going to sew now. And I'm going to stretch it out a little bit as I sew around. So once you have stitched that casing down all the way around, it should look like this. So let's flip it to the right side, and then we're just going to hem the ruffle, and we're just going to do that with a regular double turned hem. So once your sleeve's done, it's time to pin the sleeve into the bodice. So I've gone ahead and pinned this in right sides together. So here's my sleeve, and here is the armhole of the bodice. So what you want to do first is match the notches. So where there are 2 notches, it's the back, and where's 1, it's the front. So match your notches here and here for the front and back, and match the side seam to the seam of your sleeve here. And you'll notice that your sleeve is bigger than the armhole. That is to allow more movement in the sleeve. So then you just gently, I don't want to undo this and repin it in for you. I don't want to overwork the fabric. You basically just gently pin it in all the way around until it's even. So you can have a look over here. So once it's sewn in, I think it will sew in evenly. If this is giving you a lot of grief, I actually, when I first sewed in the sleeve, it was suggested that after I pin it in, I hand baste it, like just a hand running stitch in place if you're having a hard time easing in a sleeve. So now I'm just going to sew it in and serge it. So I started to sew in the sleeve, and you can see it's the top layer here, the sleeve part that's eased in. It's almost a little bit, you can see that's bigger than the armhole underneath. So as you sew, just sew, I don't sew with my pins, just sew really carefully, and you almost want to try and like flatten it out as it goes under the machine. Now it's time to sew the yoke together. So we're going to make a French seam on both shoulder seams. So we're going to match that wrong sides to wrong sides, give it a stitch, flip it the other way, stitch it, and you've got your French seam. Now that we've sewn on the ruffle on the front, we're going to French seam the center front seam. So we're going to sew it wrong sides together and make a French seam as before. So once you have your bib part French seam together, we're going to grab our bodice and we're going to pin it on. So this V matches up here, and I'm going to put a big pin right in the middle there. And then we're going to pin this all the way around. Once you've pinned it all the way around, we're just going to sew it at the sewing machine with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And when we get to here, we're going to have to pivot. I'll show you how to do that. So I've sewn the bib on, so I'm coming right up to, this is the center front V. And you know what? I'm just going to hand crank, or I'll slowly do a couple stitches. Basically, I'll leave my pin in, hand wheeling it like right up until I'm about to hit it. Okay. With my needle in, I'm at the very tip now. I'm actually gonna pivot it a bit, do one stitch, and straighten it out this way. This is a little bit tricky here. Just take your time, make sure everything's lined up. You might want to just have a peek under here and see that it is in the right spot, and then continue to sew around the rest of the edge. Now that the first part of the collar is on, take the next piece and pin it right sides together and sew along the top edge. Once you have your skirt panels French seamed together and the other edges of the center back pieces serged, then we are going to put in gathering stitches along the top. So to do that, you can do one row. I like to do 2 rows of gathering stitches, which is your longest stitch length. Most machines, that's a 4, and then we'll gather that together. So once we've done the gathering stitch around the top waist of the skirt, we're going to sew the center back seam together, but we're not going to do a French seam this time. We're going to do a regular seam. So that's why I've gone ahead and I've serged that already, and I put a pin in here where the notch is. So that's the notch where the zipper would end. So then we are just going to sew that from the zipper notch down with a regular stitch length and press your seam open. Now it should look like this. So we're going to sew that with a small seam allowance, then flip it over and do the French seam. So I actually have now gone and serged the back seam. If you're serging, I find it's easier to do this before you put in the zipper, but if you're binding, you might as well wait till the zipper's in before you bind it. So we need to sew with a basting stitch, like your long stitch length on your machine, from this point where the seam stops in the center back up to the collar, but you don't need to do the top part. You just need to do till here because we're going to end up folding this back down. So just put a basting stitch from the bottom to the collar. So what I've done here now is I have hand basted the zipper to the seam allowance on one side, and you want to really make sure that the center of your zipper is in the center of your seam. So I'm just about to do it on the other side, and just make sure we're sewing it just to the seam allowance. And then when we go to sew it with the machine, we are just going to sew for the invisible zipper, the zipper tape, and the seam allowance, and we're not going to sew the bodice of the dress. So now I've got the zipper tape basted on, and I'm just about to start sewing. So I've got my zipper foot on here, and just to make sure you can see, here's my seam allowance here. So I'm not sewing the front bodice or the back bodice, okay? Just the zipper tape and the seam allowance. And you really want to get your sewing needle as close to the zipper without actually sewing the zipper teeth, okay? As I'm approaching the end here, I'm just gonna show you, if you sew right up to the zipper tab, you're gonna have a hard time sewing like around this edge and get like a weird little bump. So what we do, we're gonna get pretty close to it, and then I've taken out the basting here, and then we'll just for a little bit, and then I'll slide it down here past where you've stitched, and then you can sew up straight. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so I got my needle down, and I'm gonna carefully slide this back. Just take your time here. There we go. Okay. I slid it out of the way and put that down and continue. Now we're ready to do the other side, and I'm going to leave this zipper tab down here a little bit, which is where it ended up being when I had sewn the first side. here, got my needle in, and I've got my foot off the pedal so I don't accidentally sew. There, okay, got it out of the way. And then I will just continue to sew all the way down to the bottom. So once your zipper is in and you've taken out the machine and hand sewn basting, I cut a little bit of like the extra zipper tape seam allowance like above the stopper. I'm going to fold that back down here at the collar. I'm going to pin that in place. So you can either machine sew this or you can hand sew this down. I machine sewed the other side, but you could definitely hand sew this. If you wanted to, if you machine sew it, you will see some stitching right here. It's your choice. So now that this has been sewn on here, we're looking at the inside of the collar and we are going to pin it in place and we're going to stitch in the ditch. So when I say that, I mean like we're going to sew in this seam allowance here and we need to catch this edge. So it's a little bit tricky, so you might want to just pin it in place first and slowly sew around. Now for the last step of our dress, we're going to do a double turn hem. So we're just going to do a small seam allowance, about 1/4 inch, turn and turn, pin it down and hem. You may also have an attachment for your machine to do a small rolled hem. If you have that, this is a great spot to use it.